You are about to see the disgrace of my messy desktop. Don't judge me.
I don't think anyone will, because we all know that all of our desktops are messy. So
Yeah, I think we've all been there. Hi, everybody. Whoops. I thought my closet door was open for a moment. My name is Jocelyn Matthews, and my talk is Building Inclusive Communities with Kindness and Empathy. And one thing that I'd love to know is if people can currently see the deck that I'm presenting.
it does look like we can. I can see it up on YouTube. So I think we're good.
Okay, great. So, okay. So I wanted to give a shout out to Cole and to Jackie and to everyone else that put this event together, and just say thank you for putting it together and having us all here. So we appreciate your work. I'm going to start now with, let's see, tell me if you can see the slide advancing. Yes? Do you see it?
I can. That looks good.
Okay. All right, great. So we're here together, and one of the things that I did was hopefully trying to bake in a little bit of Q&A as we go. I know that we are all in a stage of life where we're looking at our own faces ad nauseum and sort of just staring at screens all the time. So I'd love for this to be a little bit more interactive. And I'll be pausing throughout to ask people if they would like to participate in an exercise, or maybe maybe give some feedback to some questions that I have instead of saving them all up for the end. So just be on the alert for that. It's not my intent to put anybody on the spot or anything. I'm just trying to keep it a little bit more engaging. So we're here together. We are a de facto community for the purposes of this call. The community is going to dissolve when this event is over, and then remnants of it are going to linger. So the community will not be active, but our membership in the community will continue, because we will all have this shared experience of having gone through this event together and been in community with one another. So a little about me. I'm I'm an inveterate people watcher. I'm not much of a conformist. I have spent a lifetime kind of moving between groups. And because of that, I've really developed a fascination with this, the concept of belonging and community, what it means to people, how it's valuable. And then it's also a bit of a two-edged sword, and we'll get into that as well, where communities can also be used for harm. I have a background in ethnography, and my fieldwork was in Cairo, where I examined how people who make a living as folk artists, identify as being members of a nation. So be prepared for a little digression there about nationality as a sense of community. I'm currently the lead admin at the DevRel Collective, which is a fantastic organization that has about 2,000 members who are developer advocates, technical evangelists, community managers, and so forth. And I myself work as a community manager and also advise startups on being community driven. So that's enough about me. You're not going to have to hear any more about me for the rest of the event.
No.
I lied. I'm going to talk about myself the whole time. So what this talk is and what it isn't, what I'm hoping that you'll walk away with is some ways to think about the nature of community, a few tactics that are based on experience, hopefully some engaging conversation, but it's not prescriptive, it's not a recipe, and it's definitely not a savior narrative. And that's a point that I might return to once or twice across this presentation. I think that when we talk about inclusion, it's very easy for it to turn into a slippery slope where people begin to talk about giving voice to the voiceless or lifting people up. And I think that there is perhaps a good heart behind that sentiment, but it's problematic in practice. So we'll touch on that lightly, but it won't get too ranty. I wanted to, whoops, did I skip over one? There we are. Okay. So what is a welcoming community? What is an inclusive community? And I'm going to pull from a source, which is Toward Common Ground. And this is something that Richard Millington draws on in his books. If you don't have his books about community, you should definitely go out and buy them if this is something that you're interested in at all. Toward Common Ground is a partnership of social and health service organizations from the town of, I want to say Guelph, and I am not at all sure that that is how you pronounce it. But let's call it Guelph for our purposes. And they define a welcoming community as a place that celebrates diversity, where every individual feels valued and included. And then they go on to say that a welcoming community has the capacity to include and meet the unique needs of everyone who lives and works in that place. So right now we're talking about communities that are a little bit more physical in nature, but this clearly also maps over to virtual communities. A welcoming community is also defined as a community that welcomes everyone and attracts people. So there's a difference between welcoming and attracting people. You might have a community that is really welcoming, but if people don't feel comfortable walking up and joining it, then it's not attracting people. And when you're not attracting people, you're losing a lot of richness and diversity that you would otherwise have. So I want to draw that distinction. So we're talking about attracting people with different backgrounds, different experiences, and very importantly, different identities. And there are some measures that we'll get into around that. But I would say in a nutshell, a welcoming and inclusive community is one that meets people's needs. People have a very strong drive to be accepted and to belong and to have meaningful connections. What's meaningful might vary from person to person, but the drive itself is very common to humanity. So when those needs are being met, then you have an inclusive and welcoming and healthy community. So this is a part where I'm reaching out to you in the call and just asking you to think about what's a community that is meaningful to you or was meaningful to you. Maybe it doesn't have to be one that you belong to right now. Do we, by the way, have the ability to see the chat while we're presenting? Because I would love to see what people are saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me take
Okay.
a look at it and we'll
Okay,
see
thanks.
if we have. And I would, you know, from a community that was meaningful to you, I know at least for me, it was the college community, right? Because that's a place where they focus a lot on that.
Sure, yeah. And I think that is also one that it's a community that as you move further away from being in college over time, begins to sort of morph, you know, like who you are changes over time. And so it's a way to connect back to yourself in the past and have this really beautiful access to a former version of yourself that feels very active when you connect to it. I know that I have communities that I belong to, and I think back and I feel almost like I can smell what the air smelled like at that point in my life. Well, that's a weird analogy. Pretend I said something.
Actually, I think that's
poetic.
great.
But yeah, it's a way to kind of resurrect this moment of time, which is really amazing when you think about it. Do we have anything else in the chat where maybe other people have?
Rosemary said her plant exchange community is one of hers.
Okay.
Yep. I do have a question for you is
Yeah.
what is a community that was meaningful to you? Because you have a lot, like the whole nostalgia thing. That you nailed that on the dot. Like I thought, it was like, yeah, that makes sense. But I would love, that's such a high perspective. I'd love to hear what yours was.
Yeah. So I have formative experiences like everybody else does, but two of the things that I thought about when I was putting together this presentation, one of my early formative experiences was religion and belonging to a religious community. And don't worry, that picture of the Bible is it's taken from a good license. I didn't steal the Bible from anywhere. And you know, another thing is when I got into high school, I started going to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And that is also another type of community. And the reason that I like these two next together is that they have like They have some differences, obviously. The dress code for one, but they also have certain similarities. And so what I'd love for people to do is to think about a community that is or was meaningful to you, and then maybe do a compare and contrast with one that you're in right now. And think about, like, what are some of the commonalities? What are some of the things that you were seeking? And what are some of the needs that were being met? So if we do a compare and contrast, communities can be opt-in versus opt-out. So this is a contrast. My religion is something that I did not opt into. It was just sort of, that was the deal. Like, you know, you grow up in a family that's a particular religion and you end up going to services. So it was really more of an opt-out community than an opt-in. Whereas something that is a theatrical or a social group, that was something that was an opt-in, where I made the decision to become involved with that group. So that's a contrast. Another point of comparison and contrast is about the point that you feel that you're a member, and I'll get back to this in a minute. At some point, you begin to identify as being a member of a community, and this is sort of key to inclusion, right? So sometimes this can happen without your even being aware of it. And I would argue that for a lot of people, it usually happens without you being aware of it. At some point, you sort of cross this like liminal moment where after a while you look back and you're like, yes, I am this person, and the person I am is somebody that belongs to these communities. So you sort of realize it after the fact, and that's something that I think is probably common across a lot of different communities. I think the sense of identity is something that also goes into pretty much any community that you belong to. And again, that's something where you identify as, I'm this kind of person who does this kind of thing. This is a fact about me. And when a community becomes a fact about you, you probably, if it's a healthy community, you probably at that point identify as having been included in that community. And then something else that I found as a commonality between the two, and also with some of the better communities I've been involved with, is that there's something for everybody. And so the participation doesn't take just one form. That, you know, if you're looking at, for example, religious communities, a lot of times you might be part of a study group, you might be part of a children's program, you might be part of, I don't know, the people who bake the cookies for the picnic. And I think an inclusive community is one that not only offers something for everybody in terms of being able to participate, but that lets that change over time. So as your interests grow and change, or as you have more time or less time, maybe you've got less time and you can't, you know, be at every single meeting of a community that you belong to, that there's still a way to belong without being pushed out because you can't participate in just one way. And I think that's really important to inclusion. So going ahead to a thought exercise, and I'm sorry, I still can't see the chat. So maybe Cole, you can help me out there.
Yeah, I got you.
So I'd love to hear it from people that are in the call, like, if you had to come up with a working definition of community, what does community mean to you? Because there's a lot of words out there that they kind of mean something, but like we use them so much that we almost can't define them. So I'd just like to get a gauge on what this means to the people that we're here with today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So let's give the chat a second here, because I know there's like I think like 15-second latency between the call and what the people on YouTube are seeing. So yeah, let's let them cue that up. I will say that, you know, I see that question, and that is such, you touched on so many points of what makes a community. You know, I haven't really considered that. It's just something that at some point I just always felt like I felt. Jackie here, she says a group of people with a common set of interests, locations, and things. And
so I have a question for you then. Are two people waiting at the same bus stop a community because they have the same goal and they're in the same space?
That's a very interesting question. Let's let the YouTube-ness
catch up. Vote. Yeah.
I mean, why not? I'm sorry.
Right. I mean, Right on, yeah. I mean, I would say some communities I think are temporary, right? Like you're traveling the same path for a little while. Like not every community lasts forever, and not every community goes like straight to your heart. Like sometimes it's just like the bus comes and you both get on, you never look at each other again. You get off separate stops. That's that. But I do think that that is a form of community. And the question is then that arises is like, what kind of communities are meaningful to people? Because maybe it was meaningful, Jackie, that we shared that bus stop moment. I don't know, but probably it might be something that we might not ever think again. But we were in that community for that space of time. I would agree. I'm going to go ahead and go to this is I always love to trot out Benedict Anderson. So Benedict Anderson was an amazing thinker who worked on theories of nation and belonging and identity. And he is the one who's really known for this concept of imagined communities. And because he looks at the nation, what he's really looking at is this idea that, and I'll just use being American as my example, that although I'm American, that means something to me. And it's meaningful enough that I can have a conversation with you, Cole, or Jackie, or Rosemary about like Americanness, being American, what Americans do. You can even talk about being more and less American. And yet there's not really this good working definition of what that even means. And the reason for that, Benedict Anderson would say, is that because communities like the nation are imagined, and not imagined in the sense that they don't exist, like they're not unicorns, but they're imagined in the sense that they're generated from our, from our beliefs and our minds and our emotions. And the example that he uses is that even in the smallest nation, you'll never know each of your fellow members, you'll never meet them, you'll never hear of them. And yet in your mind of each one of you, there lives the image of your communion. And so I'll just like say that again in a different way, which is that as an American, if I wanted to meet every other American in the country, there's no physical possible logistical way I could do it, right? I could start knocking on doors. I could like run out of this room, like, bye, and I'm gonna go knock on some doors. And I mean, just like the birth rate alone would like jack me up within probably, I would never even get out of my city, right? So how do we have this concept of this imagined community as a nation? And it's so real that people will die for it. People will do these incredibly involved things because of this belonging and this sense of community. So I'm going to throw that out there. I'm going to move on. I'm a nerd. I had to get Benedict Anderson in there, but I'd like you to kind of keep that as a grounding theory as we talk about some of the more nuts and bolts tactic stuff. So counting, measuring, and weighing. This is something that community managers like myself have sweaty nightmares about, like KPIs, having to generate reports, having to sort of prove that people are in your community, who they are, what they're getting out of it. And again, this goes to the heart of inclusion, which is that you definitely don't want to build a community where, it's just, it's not inclusive, and there's not a lot of, I know I keep using the word diversity, but like, in the sense of nature diversity, like, there's just, everybody's all one kind. You don't necessarily want that. I don't ever want that. That's just not something I'm interested in doing professionally. And so if you think about how these ideas map to inclusion, they say what's get measured gets done. But the question is, what do you measure? So I know that people are always wanting techniques for things and tactics, and I'm going to name check Richard Millington again by his book. And one of the sources that he points to is the sense of community belonging. So having a sense of community belonging is a feeling that members matter to one another and that they matter to the group. there are benefits to having that sense of belonging. And there are studies out there that really show that people who have a strong sense of community say their health is better, their mental state is better. There are a lot of studies out there that show that people live longer when they have a sense of community and when they feel like they belong somewhere. And then there are also outcomes to people's physical health as well. So people who get certain types of diseases have worse outcomes if they don't feel like they have a community to be embedded with and to rely on. It makes things harder for them. It's, obviously. So going back to this slide, there's a great site called Toward Common Ground. And there's also a survey that is called the Sense of Community Index. And the Sense of Community Index is one that's been put together that measures, in a social science sense, whether people in a given community are feeling good about belonging, how much other people's opinions matter to them. This is a key piece of inclusion. When other people don't matter to you, you really don't bother to bring your best self. And so you always need to be looking for ways to build that in. It measures whether problems are solved by members. And this is also something that maps back to inclusion. So when you have that sort of very heavy top-down approach, you typically find that people might find that they have a sense of belonging, but that it's a sense of belonging that typically sort of lacks agency. People don't really come up with a lot of fresh, innovative ideas. And it also tends to lead to a community where people are welcoming, but they're kind of looking up first to figure out how to make that welcome happen. So you get this sort of very formulaic, it might be very courteous on the surface, but courtesy is not the same thing as kindness. So courtesy, manners, etiquette are things that people have evolved over time. Particularly, I would say etiquette is a controlling mechanism. It's a way for people to be around each other in a predictable way that does not go against the grain of the existing authority structure. It's not the same thing as making people feel good about being in your house. I think we probably all know somebody like that who's a stickler for etiquette. And although they're doing everything by the book, when you go to their house, you don't feel great. You feel like you might get in trouble. You feel like, if you spill something on it, you spill the juice on the napkin and there's a stain that it's going to be held against you. So these are different things, although we talk about them as though they're the same. The Sense of Community Index also measures things like expectations around length of membership. And I put the link in there. I would say if this is something that you're interested in, you do need to get permission to use this survey. And you do need to, I believe, agree to contribute back the data. And you need to fill out a form to get it. It's not a casual thing, but it's extremely insightful and useful. So if you're looking to build an inclusive community, I would definitely check it out. This is another thing about the SCI, but I'm going to keep it moving. Okay, keeping members engaged. So we talked about this already, how you want to have something for everybody. And what I'm going to ask you to do now is cast your mind back in the past to the community that you thought of when I asked you to consider a community that you've been a part of. Cole, what was yours again?
Oh, just college.
College, that's right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So in college, would you say that there were ways for every person in the college to participate as a member of the university?
Yeah, I mean, I would say obviously there are ways that possibly I wasn't able to fathom that maybe some people would want, but from my limited perspective, it seemed that way.
Okay, cool. Would you say that the community was sustaining of change over time and that it allowed you to grow? Or did you feel that it was a community that sort of clipped your wings when maybe you wanted to try something out of your previous experience? Was that acceptable or was that punished?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because for me, the point of time is once you near the end of college and you're about to leave, doesn't really change with you at that point because it expects you to move on.
Yeah, yeah. My college was very big on that. I went to UC Berkeley, and they are like, this is how many semesters you get. Like, hit the road. You know, they're all about like, we got a new crop coming in, so like, keep it moving, kid. You know, and I feel like a lot of people discover themselves in college. You know, probably also because for a lot of people it's the first time out of the house. And so you have like a lot more leeway to kind of maybe do something that you might have wanted to do and didn't have the ability to do. And as long as you can keep paying your tuition, then yeah, you can. I mean, that's also a problem at UC Berkeley. We have unfortunately a lot of students that are homeless right now. So, you know, it's inclusive in some ways, it's not inclusive in other ways. And then talking about how new and existing members mesh, are there rituals? And I would say in college, there were definitely a lot of rituals to the onboarding, especially, and not just like frat hazing, but just registering for your first class, doing the foot tour, doing all of these things, you know, like buying the school sweater and all that jazz. So those are all ways that the community is extending itself to be inclusive. And I'm sure for everybody who's out there, you can think of examples. Onboarding and retention, this is, you know, also related to what we just talked about. I would say going back to technical communities, you know, here are some questions like, what's your registration form look like? Can everyone get through it? You know, is it accessible to everybody? Are you asking for people's pronouns? For God's sake, ask for the pronouns. It's free. It doesn't even cost any money. I don't know why everybody doesn't do it. Have you checked in with your members about the joining flow? This is something that I've seen as a community manager. We set up this joining flow and we're like, awesome. And then you never have to join again because you're super admin. So it's like, you know, maybe 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the line, you don't even remember what's on your registration form, and you have no idea what it feels like to step through that process. So this is something you can go to your community and get that information from. Where are members falling through? So this is tricky to measure. You know, you kind of have to get their contact information if someone falls through and you want to get at them. So like, you know, you can think about the order of your fields on the registration form, maybe get their email first. And if they dodge out on you, maybe you could ask them why. That's dicey, depends on your community. Some people hate that. They're like, don't ever at me. Some people feel very taken care of, so it varies. What's a sticky member look like to you? And then do you have a hypothesis as to why that is? And I would say always be testing these hypotheses. So if your hypothesis is that a sticky member who feels like they belong, who generates a sense of some aspect of their identity around your community, who feels happy and included and folded, gathered in, like what are the first few things that someone like that does? Do they first go and create a thread? Do they first go and read everything? Do they go to your guidelines first so that, you know, maybe a good citizen act might be that they're reading every single bit of your code of conduct? That's going to vary from community to community. So you need to really look into that. So this is, how did that slide get in there? Legal one community, not work related, which we already did. So I'll ask you to keep the same one in mind. And I don't need to wait. I'm going to keep it moving. I love that
awesome
baby.
Picture though. Yeah.
Oh, I know. Suspender baby is like the best thing on the internet.
It is.
So, so one thing about inclusion that, and Cole, I'd love to do a time check because I don't want to disrespect and go over my slot. Am I still, no, I'm still good for time?
Let me check.
Okay. I'll keep
Jackie,
talking
if
while
you can
do
hear me.
that.
Yeah, I'll check
So
and you keep talking.
Okay, so this is a multimodal approach that somebody said to me once. It was a friend of mine who's a woman, and it almost sounds like something that a pickup artist would say, but they said that the key to any good relationship between people is to be generous and make the other person feel safe. And that sounds very simple, right? It's not, because to be generous with another person, generosity is not only giving something people that giving something to people that they want, which is very subjective, but it's also giving something that you feel is valuable. Like, it's not really generosity if you give somebody something that you think is junk, even if they're happy with it. And then making people feel safe is also very subjective. So different people need different things to feel safe. Some people need a lack of ridicule. Some people need a lot of attention. Some people need no attention. They need you to stop jabbering at them because they're an introvert and they need to recharge. And so being able to just understand what it means to the person you're dealing with, for someone to feel like you were generous with them and for someone to feel safe around you, is actually this almost never-ending exercise, which is fascinating. But what I can say is that most people have an overlapping set of drives. People want acceptance. We talked about this earlier. People want safety, and that also very much extends to physical safety, which cannot be overestimated in a technical community, especially. I think that if that is a problem you have not had, it is probably difficult to understand how pervasive that fear can be around safety, and also like how easy it is to get at people. Like, if you're really out for it, there are a lot of things. So you want to build in as much safety around people as you can. You don't want your members getting doxxed. You don't want your members getting harassed. You need to really think through your DM system. There is some terrible stuff that can happen on DMs. And I used to teach teenagers that those kids will sit there with the face of an angel and be texting under the table. Oh my God, you think you're dealing with the best kid in the world. So you need to build in structures where your little angel cannot be torturing somebody else, because you really don't know from the surface. Anything can be happening in private spaces. So you need to really be mindful of that. You can't have inclusion if people aren't physically safe. It's just not possible. People also have the drive for meaningful connections, a life that improves over time. And so when you think about that in tech communities, you need to also realize that this doesn't need to be a zero-sum game. So when I'm talking about building in these structures around like what can happen in a DM, yes, your liberty, but there are so many ways to be liberated that also are safe. And so it's not like you have to take one away to get the other most of the time. It's that you just need to be really diligent and really inquisitive for how to support both of those needs at once. Because even though some people would almost want to think that they're in opposition, I don't think that they are. I think they're highly compatible. Okay, so going back to the group that you talked about earlier, let's talk about exclusion. So what are some times in the community that you're thinking of that you ever struggled with feeling included in that group, and what did it feel like?
Is that a question to me, or I
That's
suppose to
just
the
for
community?
everybody. I can go.
Yeah.
I mean, let's see.
Yeah.
So
We do have, just so you know, we do have about 5 minutes.
okay, all right.
Yeah, for
Well,
me, it was
let's
just,
not navel
go ahead.
gaze for too long, but I would say maybe
Yeah.
think about that, after this talk, and maybe take some time as you go about the communities that you belong to, and just check in with yourself and say, like, what are some things that are happening that don't feel great? I mean, what did it feel like felt bad? I go a little bit deeper than that. Look for the nuance. So here's a note of optimism. I think that tech really attracts people who are interested in cracking things open. It attracts people who are not passively accepting the status quo. I think it really attracts people who like to see how things work, right? And sort of strip things down and be like, what's really happening here? Like, why does this thing turn on when I push that button? Like, what's the cause there? And we can bring that approach to building communities as well. Especially around, I think, emerging techs, there's a lot of latitude there. And this idea that an X looks like Y doesn't have to keep existing. And, we've seen that a lot on Twitter. There's been things where, this is what an engineer looks like. I think this is what a scientist looks like. I forget the meme. We recently had one, there was a bathing suit. I think it was DevOps bathing suits, or maybe crypto security bathing suits. You know, you don't have to follow what has happened in the past. And as we move forward, I would urge people to not follow what's in the past. What are some barriers? So here's a way to flip things on its head. Here's a barrier. A lot of times people exclude me from things, a microbiologist saying, oh, she's going to be the only Black person there. Don't invite her, she won't feel comfortable. Well, how can we make that inclusive? I would say, and this is also like a feature of being a sort of person who's attracted to tech, we love complexity. Sometimes the simplest answer is the best. If someone's being excluded because they're going to be the only Black person there, number one, don't exclude them for that reason. You don't know if she'll feel comfortable or not. Number two, find some other Black people, and then that won't be the situation anymore. You'll see that, and this is pulled from Harvard Business Review, nearly half of Black women and nearly half of Latinas have been mistaken for administrative or custodial staff. And this is something that also extends to the virtual realm. So this is something that happens to me all the time. I mean, in the before times, I think one of the last meetups that I went to, I had 3 different people come up to me and demand that I refill the sandwich tray or stock a drink or something like that. It sucks. So what's the flip side of that? Don't assume that people are custodial staff unless they're wearing a custodial, I don't know, jumpsuit or something. Like, it really is that simple. People, I don't know why people make these things so much more complex. So, you know, another one, this microbiologist doesn't like to discuss personal things because they'll feel judged. What's the flip side of that? Don't judge people for their personal life. I mean, I know I won't belabor it anymore, but it really is that simple. So is there a magic bullet? Yes and no. Having diverse folks in your community is not going to magically fix the inclusion issues that I'm talking about. I will also say, from my own experience, that also sucks, where you sort of are told and informed on your arrival to a community that they feel that their work is done and sort of like walk away wiping their hands. They're like, you know, we did it, guys. No, you really didn't. 99 times out of 100, you really, really didn't. And so you want to just don't treat people like tokens. This is simple, but it needs to be said because it still happens. So a key point of inclusion is that you see people as a whole human. And when you do that, you have a starting point. If you don't do that, you have nothing. So really, you know, do the work, understand what it is for them to exist in the space. And I also realize, as I'm saying this, that I'm sort of centering the non-marginalized people when I say, like, do the work, which is something I'm not really comfortable with. The reason that I'm doing that is because, honestly, the work should be done by the non-marginalized people, not because they're more important in the equation on the cosmic level. Look at the power structure in your group. Who's talking more? Who's being listened to more? Whose word goes, and who has to keep talking and justifying and explaining and backpedaling and providing more evidence all the time. Don't make people do that. So the presence is a start, but it takes much more. And then, you know, I would say be impeccable with your word. So don't kill people's enthusiasm. People come to your community because they want to be there, or else they want to access to something that you're doing. They want to be part of something. Don't ever be that person that makes somebody go from that giddy, excited feeling of like, oh gosh, I hope everybody likes me, this is so cool, to I don't ever want to go back there. And the way to do that is to really be impeccable with your word. Look at your code of conduct, look at your goals, write your mission statement, and then always keep going back to that. Like, don't just put it up and think that the work is done, but just go back every day, go back every week, go back constantly and just check and ask yourself, well, the last 5 things I did in my community, who are the last 5 people that I talked to? What was it like to each of those things stitch back to the mission and the goals and the values that you say that you espouse? Because that drift, once it happens, it's easier to correct it at the beginning. So I'm going to stop here. And I think the Q&A is, we probably don't have time for a more full-featured Q&A. If we do, I'm happy to take some questions. If not, then I would just say thank you for your time. And I'm so happy that I got to engage with you today.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think that we are going to make some more space just for QA. I know it was such a good talk. I was, having both obviously been in a number of communities, but also started a number of communities. I personally had some questions for you that, I faced in the past. I'm sure other people have. So one of the things in the beginning of the talk that really drew me in was your idea that safety and all those other things, those are one part, but are you attracting people, right? Are you actually attracting people to your community and to you? From an outside perspective looking in, do you have like a set of factors like that to you are that create that magnetism?
So, for me, a lot of it has to do with how people talk to each other. I also look at, just aside from these other standard things around inclusion, I look to see how active the community is. And I look to see if that maps to something I have time for. If sometimes the community is too active, I'm like, whoa, can't sign. I'm not reading the whole Silmarillion for you people. Like, that. Like, that's way too much. Like, I can't remember all these Targaryens' names. That's too much. But, also, like, if some place is really dead, I'm like, oh, there's like, nobody goes to an empty nightclub, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I look at. And, I think particularly as a woman, a lot of times women will look to see, is this someplace I'm going to get harassed? And that factors into how attractive the community is. A lot of women lurk for a long time. Like they're kind of testing the waters. So I think that's also a piece of attraction, is sort of before the new person even interacts or even makes an account, is just sort of showing that this is a non-toxic place to be. And then the last thing I would say that attracts me is if something professionally can get me ahead. Like, I used to be an engineer. That means you're always having to learn a new language, especially if you're consulting. You're like, oh, what's the next thing I'm going to make money off of? Like, is it, Ruby on Rails? When Ruby on Rails came out, it was like, oh, like, should I learn this or not? And if it looks like there's money in something, that's very attractive to me. Like I said, I'm an American. Yeah.
So another question I have for you. You mentioned that, obviously you want to encourage diversity, you want to bring diversity in. What I've always found interesting is someone, and perhaps I'm wrong, this is my limited perspective, but someone always winds up being the nexus that creates the foundation from that complexity. How do you, as someone who brings these members in and wants to represent this broad range of diversity that perhaps you aren't necessarily a part of, like perhaps you have, say, gamers come in and you're not a gamer, right? That's a very extreme example because you'd say they go to a gaming community, but perhaps these members coming in with diversity have attributes that you don't necessarily vibe with. How do you deal with that?
So I think if you have moderators that do vibe, like, I think you should look at your moderators as a collection and just be like, who are we as a group and what are we bringing? So don't hire or don't nominate people that are just like you. That's one way to do it. Another way is to form councils and just, honestly, a lot of times just communities will do your job for you if you ask them and are like not trying to be sneaky about it. You're like, hey, like, here's something I'm not great at that I want to get better at. Would you be willing to sit with like 4 other people and talk about this thing that I don't know very well? And people are very, very responsive to that.
That makes sense. So in other words, use the other members within your group to form that. Okay, that makes sense. And then I have one last question because I know I am because I'm just interested in this topic, but I know that I'm also holding up our next person. But I want to know, how do you deal with unifying diversity into a singular vision? Because some people argue that you need a lack of it in order to achieve that. But how do you funnel that to make it work and go further than someone who would say that you want, unity around something, if that makes
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, I know what you mean. I think like, you sort of get that rhetoric of we got to move fast, no time to slow down. Like, and I just honestly, I think it's a crock. Like, very rarely do I find that these people who are saying that are basing that on anything empirical at all. Like, it's like, okay, well, when's the last time that you slowed down to include all of these diverse people that you're worried about? And the answer is basically always never.
That's true.
So, like, take it with a grain of salt, be my response. I hope that's not too cynical.
No, you know what? I've never thought to just say that back.
I mean, like, it's the basis of the scientific, like, that you have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you compare it to like a case, and then you see if that's true or not. And
Mhm,
like, it just always devolves to this truthiness that is
mhm.
like utterly convinced of itself. And I'm like, where's the data there? And I've never had anybody come back to me with any data that I would say is persuasive.
Yeah,
So
that's you know what? I've never thought to do that too. It's just like you said, it's just like accepted as truth in some circles, and they speak of it as such. And so sometimes you forget to question it. So it's a
because they
very good
always
point.
sound so sure.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like I totally get that.
yeah,
But yeah, just stay
absolutely.
open, always be questioning. I think that's
Yeah,
probably a good walk away for people to take, is just always be questioning, always be curious.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Jocelyn. This was a great talk, one that, all communities and industries could use more of. I learned a lot.